You won't need it where you're going. My grandfather said those words while chemotherapy was still dripping into my arm. I stared at the phone, certain I'd misunderstood him. Where exactly do you think I'm going? Silence. Then my grandmother spoke, softer but somehow worse. Audrey, please don't make this harder than it already is. We had to think about the future. I looked down at the certified documents spread across my hospital blanket. The Bennett family home. The rental properties. The investment accounts. Voting control of the family trust. Everything my grandparents had spent years telling me I would eventually protect had been transferred to Daniel Cole. My sister's husband. Not my sister. Not me. Daniel. And while I was fighting lymphoma, they had already decided I wouldn't live long enough to object. Who told you I was dying? I asked. My grandfather exhaled. We have information. That was the moment my fear changed. Because my doctors had never told me, I had weeks left. Someone else had. The chemotherapy pump clicked beside me as I pulled the first page closer. 3 hours earlier, I'd been trying not to throw up. A nurse had dimmed the lights because the medication gave me headaches, and I'd been half asleep when a courier appeared at the doorway. Audrey Bennett. I raised my hand weakly. He walked in holding a thick envelope. Certified delivery, signature required. I actually assumed it was another insurance problem. Cancer teaches you that even when your body is falling apart, somebody still wants paperwork. I signed. Then I saw the law firm's name in the corner. I knew that firm. My grandparents had used them for estate matters for years. As an estate planning attorney myself, I'd helped Richard and Alina Bennett organize parts of their holdings long before I got sick. I never charged them. They were my grandparents. I thought protecting what they'd built was simply what family did. The documents in that envelope told me family had made a different calculation. A recent amendment transferred controlling interests that had been designated for me to Daniel. My hands shook as I turned each page. There was language about continuity, stability, preserving assets in light of Audrey Bennett's rapidly deteriorating medical condition. I stopped. Rapidly deteriorating. At my appointment that morning, my oncologist had told me the opposite. Treatment was brutal, but the tumors were responding. I called my grandmother first. Why is Daniel's name on everything? Her pause told me the paperwork wasn't a mistake. We made the practical decision. You signed my inheritance over while I'm in chemotherapy. Daniel has been helping us, she said. You've had other things to worry about. My treatment isn't a funeral. Then Grandpa took the phone. Audrey, enough. Enough. We're trying to make sure the family is taken care of. I'm still part of the family. His voice hardened. You won't need it where you're going. I couldn't answer for several seconds. A nurse across the room looked toward me. I ended the call before my voice broke. Then I called Vanessa. Straight to voicemail. Again. Nothing. The third time, Daniel answered from her phone. She's busy. Why do you own my grandparents' estate? He sounded almost bored. Nobody owns anything yet. We're making sure the family's future is secure. Wait. Audrey, focus on getting better. I am getting better. Another pause. Then he said, that's not what we've been told. My fingers tightened around the phone. By who? He hung up. I went back through the papers. This time, I stopped reading them like a granddaughter. I read them like an attorney. Buried inside the amendment was a reference to a medical declaration supposedly supporting the transfer. I had never signed an authorization for my grandparents' estate lawyer to receive my oncology records. I had never given Daniel permission to access anything. And then I found the sentence that made every other betrayal in that room suddenly look like part of something much larger. According to the declaration, my condition was terminal. My expected survival was measured in weeks. I read it twice, then once more. That statement had never come from my doctor. So while my grandparents were preparing to give Daniel my future, someone had been feeding them a version of my cancer that wasn't true. And I needed to know who had decided to bury me before I was dead. The first thing I noticed when I walked into my grandparents' house was that my picture was gone. Not moved. Gone. The framed photo that had sat on the hallway table for nearly 10 years, me standing between Grandma and Grandpa at my law school graduation, had been replaced by a picture of Vanessa and Daniel. I stopped beside the table. Grandma noticed. "Audrey, come sit down. You look exhausted." "I'm exhausted." I kept staring at the new photo, but apparently not too exhausted to be erased. Grandpa shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Daniel was standing near the dining room doorway with a folder under one arm, like he had a meeting scheduled in a house that wasn't his. Vanessa sat on the sofa and wouldn't look at me. I lowered myself carefully into a chair. The chemo had left my legs weak, and I hated that Daniel watched me struggle. Grandma folded her hands. "We didn't erase you." "Then explain the paperwork." Daniel stepped forward. "We've already explained this." I looked at him. "No, you've repeated the phrase family security 3 times. That's not an explanation." Grandpa leaned forward. "Daniel has been helping us manage things while you've been sick. I helped you manage those things for years." "Audrey." "For free." Vanessa finally looked up. "Why are you making this about money?" I turned toward her. "Because your husband now controls property that was supposed to come to me." Her jaw tightened. "You're sick." "I'm aware." "Then maybe you should focus on that." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded rehearsed. I looked back at my grandparents. "Who told you I refused more treatment?" Grandma blinked. "What?" "You told Aunt Carol I stopped treatment." Daniel's eyes shifted. Grandpa answered first. "We were told you weren't continuing." "By whom?" A silence settled over the room. I continued. "Who told you my doctors said recovery was impossible?" Grandma rubbed her thumb over her wedding ring. "They said the outlook was very poor." "Who is they?" No answer. Daniel stepped in again. "Medical situations are complicated." "I'm an attorney, Daniel. I understand complicated. I'm asking for a name." "You don't need to interrogate them." I looked at my grandfather. "Did you speak directly to my oncologist?" His face changed. "Only slightly." "But enough." "No." "Did Grandma?" "No." "Did either of you receive anything directly from the hospital?" Grandma glanced toward Daniel. There it was. A tiny movement. But I saw it. I stood despite the weakness in my knees. "Show me what he gave you." Daniel's voice sharpened. "That's enough." "No, I don't think it is." Vanessa stood too. "Audrey, stop." I looked at her. "You knew." Her face hardened. I knew Grandpa and Grandma had to make a decision. Based on what? She said nothing. That silence told me more than any confession could have. Grandpa pushed himself out of his chair. We were trying to prevent chaos by giving everything to Daniel. He said someone needed to be ready. Ready for what? Grandma's eyes filled. For after. The word landed between us. After me. I looked from one face to another. They had already built a version of the family where I didn't exist. I picked up my bag. Daniel gave a small shrug. "Maybe you should rest." I ignored him and walked toward the front door. Outside, the afternoon air hit me harder than I expected. I made it halfway down the path before someone called my name. "Audrey." It was Mrs. Parker from next door. She was in her 70s and had known my grandparents longer than I had been alive. She walked toward me slowly. "You all right?" "No." She looked toward the house, then lowered her voice. "That husband of your sister's has been here constantly." I turned. "Daniel. Almost every day while you were in the hospital." "Doing what?" "Carrying papers, big folders. Some had hospital logos on them." My stomach tightened. "You're sure?" "I notice things." She glanced toward the front window. "One day your grandfather asked me if I'd ever had to make decisions for someone who was dying." My throat went dry. "What did you say?" "I told him dying people usually deserve to be included in decisions about their own lives." I looked back at the house. Mrs. Parker stepped closer. "I don't know what's in those folders." Then she lowered her voice even more. "But I don't think those papers were what he claimed they were." She touched my arm. "If I were you, I'd find out exactly what your grandparents were shown." The room erupted in applause just as I stepped through the doors. Daniel stood near the fireplace with a glass of sparkling water in one hand, smiling as relatives congratulated him. Someone raised a toast. "To Daniel," my uncle announced, "for stepping up and making sure the Bennett family legacy stays in good hands." More applause followed. I hadn't been invited. A cousin had quietly called me the night before. "You should know what's happening," she had whispered. "Everyone thinks you're too sick to come." I adjusted the scarf covering my hair and walked farther into the room. Conversation slowed, then stopped. Several relatives stared at me as if they were seeing a ghost. Daniel's smile disappeared for only a fraction of a second before returning. "Audrey," he said smoothly, "you made it." I wouldn't have missed this. Grandma stood abruptly. "Honey, you should be resting." "I've done enough resting." I looked around the room. More than 30 members of my extended family were watching. Some looked relieved. Others looked deeply confused. I took a slow breath. "Before anyone says another word," I began, "can someone explain why everyone here believes I'm dying?" The silence was immediate. My Aunt Melissa frowned. "We thought—" She stopped. "You thought what?" I asked gently. My cousin Brian answered instead. "Daniel said you entered hospice." A murmur spread through the room. Another aunt spoke up. "I was told you'd stopped chemotherapy." My uncle shook his head. "I heard your doctors gave you only a few weeks." I slowly turned toward Daniel. "I've been in chemotherapy every week." I reached into my bag and removed a folded letter. "This is from my oncologist." I handed it to Grandpa. He adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud. "Patient continues responding positively to treatment. Current scans demonstrate measurable improvement. Treatment plan remains active." His voice grew quieter with every sentence. Grandma reached for the letter. Her hands trembled. This says you're improving." "It does." She looked at me. "Daniel told us." "I know." Across the room, relatives began whispering to one another. None of the stories matched. One cousin believed I had refused treatment. Another thought I had lost consciousness weeks ago. Someone else had heard I was already receiving end-of-life care. Every version ended with me dying. None of them came from me. Daniel stepped forward before anyone could ask another question. "Medical situations change," he said calmly. "Everyone's overreacting." I folded my arms. "So my prognosis magically improved after you convinced my grandparents to transfer the estate." "That's not what I said." "No," I replied, "it isn't." His confidence slipped just enough for me to notice. Before either of us could continue, my cousin Rachel hurried toward me. I almost forgot. She reached into her purse. "I printed this because something about it felt strange." She handed me several pages. It's the email Daniel sent the family. I unfolded the papers. The subject line read, Family update regarding Audrey's condition **. As I read, my stomach tightened. It described my illness as terminal. It claimed my condition had rapidly worsened. It urged the family to support my grandparents' difficult decision to transfer estate responsibilities immediately, before it is too late. I had never seen the email. No one had asked me if it was true. They had simply believed it. I flipped to the final page. Attached was what appeared to be a medical summary. My heartbeat accelerated. There, at the bottom of the page, was my oncologist's electronic signature. Except I knew instantly something was wrong. Because my doctor had never written those words. And he had certainly never signed that document. I looked up from the pages. Daniel was already watching me. For the first time since this nightmare began. He looked worried. 3 days later, the hospital's compliance office called me before I could call them. Ms. Bennett, the compliance director said, we've completed our initial review. I tightened my grip on the phone. And the medical summary circulated to your family does not exist in our system. I closed my eyes. So it's fake. We can state that it was never generated by this hospital. That was the first confirmation. It wouldn't be the last. Within a week, my attorney had assembled a forensic document examiner, a cybersecurity specialist, and an independent digital investigator. I knew enough about estate litigation to understand one thing. Suspicions wouldn't reverse an inheritance. Evidence would. The forensic examiner spread copies of Daniel's email across the conference table. He pointed to the electronic signature. At first glance, it looks authentic. But it isn't. He enlarged the signature on a monitor. The hospital uses encrypted digital certificates tied to each physician. He highlighted several lines of metadata. This image was copied from another document and pasted onto this one. So my doctor's signature was stolen. Yes. The cybersecurity specialist slid another report toward me. We also reviewed access logs provided by the hospital. He tapped a highlighted section. Several attempts were made to access your protected medical records using unauthorized credentials. Were they successful? No. I frowned. Then how did Daniel convince everyone? He didn't need your real records. The investigator leaned forward. He only needed something that looked convincing. For the first time, I could finally explain what had happened. Daniel hadn't hacked my medical file. He had manufactured a believable replacement. Meanwhile, formal legal notices arrived at my grandparents' home. They requested that every document connected to the estate transfer be preserved pending litigation. Grandpa called me that evening. His voice sounded older than I remembered. We received papers. I know. Are you really taking us to court? I'm asking a court to determine whether fraud was used. A long silence followed. Then he quietly asked, Did Daniel lie to us? I think he lied to all of us. 2 days later, Grandpa demanded Daniel come to the house. Vanessa was already there when he arrived. According to Grandma, the conversation began politely. It ended with shouting loud enough for neighbors to hear. Grandpa placed my oncologist's genuine treatment letter beside Daniel's fabricated report. Explain this. Daniel barely glanced at it. Medicine changes. Grandpa's voice rose. Did you tell us Audrey was dying? I told you what I believed. No, Grandpa snapped. You told us doctors had confirmed it. Daniel's answers became shorter. Less certain. Every explanation contradicted the last. Vanessa watched the argument unravel in stunned silence. That evening, she began looking through financial records Daniel had always insisted she didn't need to see. She found loans. hidden accounts, wire transfers, and something even worse. Several inherited properties had already been pledged as collateral for speculative business investments. He had started borrowing against assets before the ownership dispute was even resolved. The inheritance had never been his destination. It had been his financing plan. When Grandpa learned that, he sat in his office for nearly an hour without speaking. Grandma later told me she had never seen him look so defeated. "We thought we were protecting the family," she whispered during a tearful phone call. "I know. We may have destroyed it." But one final answer still remained buried. While preparing our court filings, my legal team requested every historical estate planning file my grandparents had ever executed. Boxes of old documents arrived from storage. Most contained exactly what we expected. Then one faded envelope changed everything. Inside was a handwritten letter signed by both grandparents nearly a year before I became ill. My attorney carefully unfolded it. Grandpa's handwriting filled the first page. It explained why they intended me to inherit control of the Bennett estate. Because I had spent years protecting it. Because I had earned their trust. Because they believed I would preserve it for future generations. Attached was a routing sheet showing the letter had once belonged in the permanent estate file. But sometime after my diagnosis, it had been removed. Someone hadn't simply hidden my future. Someone had deliberately buried the very document, proving what my grandparents had always intended. The morning our court hearing was scheduled to begin, my attorney and I were walking toward the courthouse entrance when two dark government vehicles pulled into the reserved parking area. Several financial investigators stepped out carrying briefcases. They walked straight past us, straight toward Daniel. He turned to greet them, then stopped cold as one investigator held up official credentials and asked him to remain where he was. The courtroom was silent enough that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Daniel sat at the defense table in a tailored navy suit, but the confidence he'd worn for months was gone. He kept glancing toward the gallery, toward Vanessa, toward my grandparents, toward the investigators seated only a few rows behind him. Nobody looked back. The judge called the hearing to order. My attorney stood first. "Your Honor, this case is not about a family disagreement over inheritance." He paused. "It is about fraud committed against both the intended beneficiary and two elderly individuals who were deliberately deceived." The first witness was the hospital's compliance director. She explained, step by step, how every legitimate medical record was stored, tracked, and digitally authenticated. Then she held up the medical summary Daniel had circulated. "This document was never created by our hospital." The courtroom remained quiet. She continued, "It does not exist in our electronic medical record system." My oncologist testified next. He looked directly at my grandparents. "I never informed anyone that Ms. Bennett had only weeks to live." He opened my treatment file. In fact, before the estate transfer was signed, Ms. Bennett's scans showed measurable improvement. He displayed the timeline. Every chemotherapy session. Every scan. Every consultation. The dates mattered, because they proved something undeniable. By the time Daniel convinced my grandparents to sign everything over, he already knew my treatment was working. He had hidden that truth instead. The forensic document examiner followed. He projected Daniel's email onto a large courtroom screen. Then he highlighted the electronic signature. This signature was copied from an unrelated medical document. He enlarged the metadata. It was digitally pasted onto a fabricated report. There was no dramatic objection. No surprise witness. Only evidence. One fact after another. Each piece fitting perfectly into the next. The cybersecurity specialist testified that someone had repeatedly attempted to gain unauthorized access to my medical records. Those attempts failed. Unable to obtain real records, whoever orchestrated the scheme created false ones instead. Finally, my attorney introduced the handwritten letter my grandparents had signed months before I became ill. Grandpa covered his face as it was read aloud. I have always intended for Audrey to receive stewardship of the Bennett estate because she has already demonstrated the integrity required to preserve it. Grandma began crying before the letter ended. She stood unexpectedly. "Your Honor." Her voice trembled. We believed she was dying. The judge looked at her gently. "Mrs. Bennett, please remain seated." She shook her head. We thought we were carrying out her wishes. Then she looked at me. "No." Her voice cracked. "We carried out his." For the first time since this nightmare began, my grandparents publicly acknowledged exactly who had manipulated them. Daniel finally took the stand. His attorney tried to frame everything as a misunderstanding. But the documents refused to cooperate. Emails contradicted his testimony. Financial records contradicted his explanations. Metadata contradicted every timeline he offered. Then came the final blow. The financial investigators testified they had traced loans Daniel secured using the transferred properties as collateral. Millions of dollars had been positioned for business ventures unrelated to my family. He hadn't protected the estate. He had planned to leverage it. The courtroom became completely still. Vanessa slowly stood. She didn't say a word to Daniel. She simply removed her wedding ring, set it on the defense table, and walked out. He watched her leave without calling after her, because there was nothing left to say. Weeks later, the judge issued the final ruling. Every fraudulent transfer was declared invalid. Ownership of the family trust, the investment accounts, and every inherited property returned to its rightful structure under my grandparents' original estate plan. The court also referred the evidence supporting document forgery, identity misuse, and fraudulent financial activity to criminal authorities. Civil judgments stripped Daniel of much of what he'd accumulated through the scheme. His business collapsed under mounting legal claims. The people who had once congratulated him quietly disappeared from his life. Vanessa filed for divorce, not because he lost the inheritance, because she finally realized their marriage had been built on lies long before mine had been stolen. My grandparents asked to meet me a month after the ruling. We sat together in the same living room where they'd once spoken about the practical decision. Grandpa's shoulders seemed smaller now. He placed the old handwritten letter between us. "I wrote this because I knew you'd protect what we built." He looked down. I stopped trusting my own judgment. Grandma reached across the table and took my hand. "We were so afraid of losing you that we listened to the person who claimed he could prepare us." Tears filled her eyes. "We never imagined he was preparing us to lose everything instead." I squeezed her hand. "I can't pretend none of this happened." She nodded. "I know." Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. Trust wasn't magically restored. Some wounds heal slowly. Others leave scars forever. But we began rebuilding with honesty instead of fear. The first legal document I prepared after the case wasn't for myself. It was for my grandparents. Together, we restructured the Bennett family trust. Independent oversight replaced blind trust. No single family member would ever again have the power to manipulate elderly relatives through secrecy or fear. A portion of the recovered inheritance funded something even more meaningful: the Bennett Hope Foundation. It provides legal assistance to cancer patients who become vulnerable to financial exploitation while undergoing treatment. Because illness should never become an opportunity for someone else's greed. Several months later, I stood back inside the oncology unit. Only this time, I wasn't there for chemotherapy. Nurses gathered in the hallway. Patients smiled from nearby rooms. I reached for the rope hanging from the brass bell. The same hands that had once trembled while opening inheritance papers now felt steady. I rang the bell. Its clear sound echoed through the corridor. The nurses applauded. Some cried. So did I. When I stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, I paused and looked up at the sky. Months earlier, people I loved had divided my future while I was still fighting to survive. They had mistaken my illness for my ending. They had measured my life by fear instead of truth. But survival gave me something far greater than an inheritance. It gave me the chance to reclaim my voice, protect my family's legacy, and ensure that no one else could ever rewrite my story while I was still alive. They built their future on the assumption that I would die, but I lived long enough to reclaim my name, my family legacy, and my future.